that's coming up later. That's good. That is possibly the best bit of the talk. If you want to skip through the next 10 minutes of me talking and the next 10 minutes of Sam talking, and then concentrate on the delicious food that will be coming up, that's the best bit of the talk. I'm Andy. I'm the Liverpool Bay Discovery Programme Officer. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing at the National Trust property on Formby, and then Sam is going to be talking about the work he's been doing on the east side of the coast at Humberside, and then Chris is going to be talking about some of the LTTs that he's been working on and some of the intangible heritage that he's been looking at. I'm afraid for all the concrete nerds in the audience, there isn't very much concrete in any of those talks. That might be a relief to some people, I'm not sure. So the village of Formby is 12 miles north of Liverpool. In 1967, the National Trust bought 202 hectares of beach and sand dune and pine forest, so 1.5 miles of coast, and then in 2017 they purchased another 1.5 miles of beach off Sefton Coast to give themselves 3 miles of beach. In the medieval period it was a very isolated area of Merseyside. There was some small fishing villages, and then as the post-medieval period moved on and we moved into the 19th century and coming to the railways, it became very heavily orientated with asparagus farming. It is the fastest eroding piece of coastline that the National Trust owns. It erodes on average 3 metres a year. On heavy storm events it can erode up to 13 to 14 metres overnight. So on the February storm of 2013, 2014, they lost 15 metres of coastline. It wasn't always like this though. Up to 1905 it was an accreting landscape, so the sand dunes were moving further and further towards the sea. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. This is a photograph of what's called the tobacco cliffs. This is waste tobacco that was dumped on the asparagus fields in the 1950s and the 1960s by the British Nicotine Company. They were shipping material into Liverpool. Anything that got spoiled would be dumped on these asparagus fields. They didn't anticipate that that was going to be eroding onto the beach line, because they didn't think the foreshore was going to erode that quickly. That's now onto the beach, spilling out everywhere across the beach and eroding quite quickly. The most famous and well-known archaeological features on the beach are the preserved prehistoric footprints that you can see on several patches of the beach around Formby. They date back to the Mesolithic period, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. They were first systematically recorded by a gentleman called Gordon Roberts in the 1980s. This is Gordon's photograph on the far side. He recorded footprints of adults and children hunting and running around. There are up to 200 metres worth of footprints. He's also recorded auroch, red deer, roe deer, wolf or domestic dog, depending on your interpretation of the site, and a type of crane which is now extinct in the north of England. We did quite a lot of recording of these in the first phase of the project. So on the left is my former colleague Megan, who went out with Therese in August 2017 to record those. So the National Trust wanted us to look at some of the more unknown archaeological features in the new area that they've purchased. Perhaps the best known feature that you can see on the foreshore is the remains of the Formby Point lifeboat house. It was built in the early 18th century. Don't quite know exactly when it was built because the records for the Mersey Dock Company were destroyed during the Blitz, but we know that it's in existence by 1820. In 1828 there was a survey of the site, and the lifeboat station was recorded as being 100 metres towards the sea. By 1828, when they actually carried out the survey, the sand dunes had moved 300 yards further forward, so the lifeboat station was actually now buried within the sand dunes. And the sand dunes move backwards and forwards across 100 years, but it doesn't get any closer to the sea than it did when it was originally built. It's not the most ideal location for it to be constructed, because even before the sand dunes started moving, when the tide goes out, you get a kilometre and a half of mud flats in front of the sand dunes. So there's quite a lot of effort to actually launch the lifeboat. But they needed it at Formby because there are somewhere around 400 to 500 wrecks in the 2-mile stretch from the mouth of the Mersey up towards Formby Point. So it's a very treacherous area, it's a very active area of shipwrecks, so they did need a lifeboat station there. We've used this lifeboat station as a survey site quite frequently. This is the Young Archaeologist Club leaders from the Council for British Archaeology. We're teaching them how to do basic archaeological skills like offset planning. Because we've used that so frequently, the National Trust wanted to go and have a look at some of the archaeological features which are slightly further away from the coast. So the first feature that we've recorded is the remains of the Formby bombing decoy. The Formby bombing decoy was built in 1940 and was designed to lure Luftwaffe bombers away from targets in Merseyside, in this case the north of Bootle Docks. It was both a Schuel site, so it was designed to mimic poorly blacked out docks and railway sidings, in this case specifically railway sidings, and it was also a starfish site, so it was designed to mimic previously bombed urban targets by detonating big barrels of fuel and big trenches of oil, so there was a lot of flames that came up and around. So the idea was to lure the Luftwaffe into bombing an area which was completely different to where they were actually looking for. This is a slightly misleading photograph, because when it was active there would have been a big earth mound around it to protect the crew that was actually inside, setting off all of the fire traps. We know that it was used after the war as well, because these large openings were cut into the side of it once the earth mound had been removed. We don't know what they're for, but they overlook the Outcar firing range, so we think they might have something to do with target practice, to do with military firing. How effective as a decoy was it? We simply don't know. We do know that Bootle Docks, where it was supposed to be defending, took a heavy hammering. The largest explosion in the UK at that time took place in the north of Bootle Docks during the May Blitz in 1940, when the SS Malakand was hit by incendiaries. She was carrying 1,000 tons of ammunition. After 4 hours of firefighting, they failed to put out the fires and she exploded. When she exploded, her hull plating was found 2.5 miles away from the site of the explosion, so it was a really large explosion. Miraculously, only 4 people died as a result of that explosion, and there were some very miraculous survival stories. Perhaps the most miraculous was a stoker who was trying to put out the fires. He was blown onto the side of the dock, and a curved piece of boilerplate landed on top of him, protecting him from the blast effects of all the ammunition going up, and he just walked away with a dislocated shoulder. And it's absolutely incredible. We know that it was heavily hit. So by the end of the war, 16,000 of the 17,000 houses in Bootle had suffered some kind of damage. We do know that some of the decoys were effective. There were 14 decoys built around Liverpool, and we know that, for instance, the decoy on Ryland, which is some distance away from Bootle Dock, but was designed to protect the south end of Bootle Dock, was very effective, because there's a report from a Luftwaffe captain who led a Pathfinder raid onto Liverpool Docks, supposedly marking out areas to hit, expressing his frustration because the Henkel bombers that were coming in after him missed the area that he marked and dropped all of their bombs on Ryland. So we know that some of the decoys did work. The next site that we're hoping to look at is this large brick wall. doesn't look very exciting as a brick wall, but this is actually a buttstock. It's the remains of a 20th century firing range. It would have had a large earth mound in front of it to stop the projectiles firing through the brick wall and hurting anybody around it. It's something of a mystery because we don't know exactly who was training there, we don't know exactly when it was built. It's also in the middle of a planned village as well, so it's actually in quite a dangerous location. There would have been quite a few people running around. So we're hoping to look at this. The only other upstanding feature on the site is the one-piece concrete which is in this talk, which is these concrete steps. That would have led to a raised firing position where the soldiers would have actually stood or laid prone on to shoot against it. The distance between the steps and the stock butt suggests that this is a 30-yard range, so it was used either for pistols or submachine guns. We're hoping to investigate it by looking at some geophys results and trying to find the buried trenches that would have been in front of the stock butt where the scorers would have sit. We're also hoping to look at this zigzag trenching in the top, which might be First World War practice trenching. You can also see in and around this LiDAR image that perhaps the decoy was successful as a result, because there are some bomb targets which have been hit around, and you can see some bomb blasts sat in the sand dunes, so we might be able to identify some of those as well with a little bit of luck. Right, hey, Sam is now going to come and talk about the East Coast.